On this episode of the CyberWatch podcast, threats to macOS come into focus, new tools and attacks make criminals' jobs easier, tires aren't the only things we should rotate regularly, and we have a personal cybersecurity safety tip for Cybersecurity Awareness Month. All this today in the CyberWatch podcast. Hello, and welcome to the CyberWatch podcast for the week of October 27th, 2024. This is your weekly roundup of the top cybersecurity news and analysis curated by the analysts at Access Point Consulting. I'm your host, Curtis Franklin. Let's get to the news. For a very long time, Apple's Macintosh computers were seen as less vulnerable to malware and attacks than the computers running Microsoft Windows. That feeling of invulnerability should have been retired long ago, but it persists for many users. Those users might pay particular attention to a pair of issues reported this week. The first is a vulnerability dubbed Shady Cider that allows a properly written shader program to overwhelm the graphics processing unit in systems, both macOS and iOS, using Apple's M-series CPUs. The result is a series of system freezes that ultimately lead to a complete system crash. Shady Cider exploits the point at which instructions in an application-related shader are translated into hardware-specific shader instructions. Shady Cider inserts code that requires compute-intensive execution that can't be avoided or optimized by any of the normal system techniques. In the end, the GPU becomes swamped, slows dramatically, and finally crashes. The most recent versions of macOS and iOS have patched for Shady Cider, but analysts warn that the basic vulnerability, the possibility of a GPU being overloaded to the point of becoming unusable, remains. Also in the Mac universe, there's news of a new bit of ransomware that's notable for pretending to be another piece of ransomware. Confusing, right? Well, according to researchers, the infamous ransomware NotLockBit is being impersonated by malware that's being called NotLockBit. The ransomware is pretty tightly targeted because it seems to work only on Intel and Apple Silicon macOS machines running the Rosetta emulation software. Prior to starting its encryption, the ransomware exfiltrates the victim's data to an attacker-controlled Amazon S3 bucket using hard-coded AWS credentials. After being notified of the campaign, Amazon suspended the AWS credentials and their associated account. But NotLockBit appears to be the first functional ransomware family targeting Mac OS systems, and it is still under active development. Companies using Mac OS systems should make sure their software is up to date and that employees are current on anti-malware training. Moving beyond Mac OS, the thriving commercial ecosystem that has grown up to serve cyber criminals is making life easier and more profitable for criminals while complicating life for defenders. The latest example of the complicating tools is the class of software or services advertised to defeat Google's red page warnings about websites containing malicious code. There are a number of strategies for red page evasion, ranging from malicious code obfuscation to forcing temporary whitelist updates. The key piece of information here is that these red page diffusers, along with every other function required to launch a malicious campaign, are available to anyone with a credit card number. The democratization of malware isn't just making cybercrime available to a new generation, it's making competently written malicious software available to just about everyone. One such everyone is TA866, or Asylum Ambuscade, a criminal organization that's been around since 2020, launching various attacks with a single theme: making money. In pursuit of this money, TA866 has used custom-written code as well as widely available malicious code that provides many of the functions required for successful cyber intrusion. In the latest campaign, Warm Cookie, a notorious malware family also called Bad Space, emerged earlier this year and has been distributed through mal-spam and malvertising campaigns. It's a backdoor allowing threat actors long-term access to compromised systems. Warm Cookie then offers a wide range of functions like payload deployment, file manipulation, command execution, screenshot collection, and persistence. An example of this kind of attack is the campaign recently launched against Cisco, a campaign that has seen sensitive data exfiltrated ahead of the demand for ransom. On October 14, the hacker known as Intel Broker announced a Cisco breach on a popular cybercrime forum. The threat actor claimed to have obtained GitHub and SonarQube projects, source code, hard-coded credentials, certificates, confidential documents, Jira tickets, API tokens, AWS private buckets, encryption keys, and other types of information. As is common in these situations, the criminals threatened to release all of this information on the web if the ransom was not paid. The hacker obtained the data from a public-facing DevHub environment. DevHub is a content management solution, and Cisco described the compromised environment as a resource center used to make available source code, scripts, and other content for customers. Cisco has since disabled public access to the CMS. A similar attack with a much different victim was announced this week with news that the Internet Archive was breached not once, but twice in the space of a month. The breach began when a threat actor found an exposed GitLab configuration file on one of the organization's development servers. The config file contained credentials to access the archive's database management system, user database, and further source code, even modifying the site. The hacker claimed to have stolen 7 terabytes of sensitive data, including Zendesk API tokens used for the organization's email support system. The exposed token had been available since December 2022 and was repeatedly and reportedly rotated multiple times since then. This is a great example of why credentials should be rotated on a regular, not to mention frequent, basis. And because October is Cybersecurity Awareness Month, we've been presenting some simple to implement tips to improve your cybersecurity. This week's tip is to always check your configuration settings. Through the years, the industry has seen many breaches that could be traced back to misconfigured cloud storage or applications. In many cases, the misconfiguration occurred because someone changed a single setting to allow a temporary condition, say access to a file by a contractor or corporate partner, and didn't realize that the single checked box caused a cascading chain of changes that resulted in a much wider access than was necessary. It's also possible in many cases to have forgotten that the access was ever granted. Another typical configuration is that case of the length of time that credentials remain valid. A single credential set for long duration, because it's rarely used, can be the back door into a system that then provides lateral access to critical information. The takeaway? Check configuration files at every change and check credentials early and often. When changes are made or configurations accepted, always log those changes and carefully search the documentation of the system for related settings that might have been automatically changed due to that one checked box. This practice of checking for unintended consequences can greatly reduce the chance that a consequence will not include opening the door to cyber criminals. Well, that's it for this week. Please join us again next week for the CyberWatch podcast, brought to you by Access Point Consulting. And be sure to visit the CyberWatch podcast on LinkedIn and at www.accesspointconsulting.com. I'm Curtis Franklin. We'll see you next week.